You pray, you ask for peace, you ask for direction, but just minutes later, your mind is already repeating fear, worry, negative scenarios, and internal dialogues that steal the stability you just sought. Have you noticed that contradiction? You speak with God, yet you continue feeding thoughts that move in the opposite direction of what you asked for in prayer. And maybe the problem isn't your faith. Maybe it's what you allow to remain in your mind. In this video, I'm going to show you how unfiltered thoughts sabotage your peace, how small internal narratives shape your spiritual life, and why prayer alone is not enough if you don't learn how to guard and direct your mind. You'll understand what the Bible really teaches about mental discipline, inner renewal, and practical spiritual responsibility. Not theory, but real application for your daily life. If you pray but still feel anxious, if your peace never seems to last, if you constantly find yourself fighting your own thoughts, then this video can change the way you see your spiritual life. Stay until the end, because you're going to discover how to break this cycle and reclaim a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, but on what you choose to feed every single day. Have you noticed how this cycle happens almost automatically, almost without you realizing it? You pray for peace, you hand your worries over to God, you feel an initial sense of relief, but just minutes later, your mind starts rebuilding the very scenario you just surrendered. It's as if there are two currents inside you, one that wants to trust and another that insists on expecting the worst. This tension doesn't come from a lack of declared faith. It comes from a mental pattern running on autopilot, repeating narratives you've never deeply questioned. James describes this condition with uncomfortable clarity. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. James 1:6-8. Double-mindedness is not the absence of prayer. It is not abandoning God. It is inner division. It's when your mouth asks for direction, but your mind rehearses defeat. It's when you declare trust, but feed images of failure. This duplication creates instability because your internal structure is fragmented. You're trying to walk spiritually with two different mental maps. Many people interpret this instability as spiritual immaturity. They assume they need to pray more, extend their devotional time, or seek stronger spiritual experiences. But the issue may not be the intensity of your prayer, it may be the coherence of your mind. If prayer points toward trust, but your thoughts reinforce fear throughout the day, you are silently neutralizing what you asked for. Peace doesn't disappear because God failed to respond. It weakens because your mind keeps reinforcing the opposite. Look closely at the pattern. A challenge appears, you pray for calm, and soon after you begin imagining negative outcomes. Your mind revisits old conversations, interprets neutral looks as rejection, and projects scenarios that haven't even happened. This process is quiet, but powerful. It shapes your emotions, influences your decisions, and even affects how you pray the next time. Prayer is meant to produce alignment, but ongoing mental narration creates conflict. What drains your peace is often not the external problem, but the internal conversation you maintain about it. Every repeated thought strengthens a neural pathway. Every imagined negative scenario increases your sense of threat. When this becomes routine, you start believing your anxiety is caused by circumstances, when in reality, it's sustained by mental repetition. Scripture does not ignore this dynamic. It points to the inner life as the origin of instability. Double-mindedness is a mind that alternates between faith and fear without choosing which truth to sustain. One moment you trust, the next you doubt. Not because God changed, but because your narrative changed. This constant shift produces emotional exhaustion. You feel like you're trying to live by faith, yet at the same time you feel trapped by thoughts that sabotage that faith. This internal friction drains energy and creates the sense that something is always misaligned. Maybe you've never labeled this as mental duplication. Maybe you've called it realism, prudence, or responsible concern. Nadu, but there is a difference between evaluating risk and feeding fear. Every time you develop a thought that contradicts what you prayed for, you strengthen a second mental structure. And two opposing structures competing for control will never produce stability. It's important to understand that negative thoughts will appear. They are part of the human experience. The key issue is not preventing them from showing up, but deciding what to do with them once they do. Do you accept them as absolute truth? Do you expand them? Do you build detailed internal dialogues around them? Or do you confront them? The mind works by reinforcement. Whatever receives continuous attention gains internal authority. When James speaks about instability, he is describing a life marked by frequent oscillation. One day you feel spiritually strong, the next emotionally unstable. This roller coaster doesn't happen because God is distant, but because your mind has not been trained to remain aligned. Declared faith combined with repeated fear creates structural conflict, and constant conflict produces spiritual fatigue. There is also a cumulative effect. Small, seemingly harmless thoughts, when repeated daily, build a dominant narrative. You begin to see everything through a lens of threat. You interpret delays as rejection. You interpret silence as abandonment. You interpret difficulties as confirmation of failure. And so your reading of spiritual reality becomes distorted, not because God is absent, but because unexamined thoughts have been repeated. This is the invisible cycle that drains your peace. It's not dramatic, it's not explosive, it's a silent pattern. Prayer without mental alignment creates temporary relief, but not lasting stability. As long as your mind keeps reinforcing fear, doubt, or comparison, the peace you ask for will continue to be interrupted. Recognizing this pattern is not a reason for guilt. It is an opportunity for clarity. Because once you identify the internal duplication, you begin to realize that transformation does not start only with what you say to God, but with what you allow to remain in your mind throughout the day. And that awareness opens the door to a deeper realignment that we need to explore. You may have never stopped to realize that repeated thoughts don't remain just thoughts. They evolve. At first, they seem like passing ideas, but when they return frequently, they begin to form a pattern. And when a pattern solidifies, it becomes a belief. That is how, often without noticing, you build an internal structure that begins to govern the way you see life, yourself, and even God. Philippians 4:8 gives a clear standard for this process. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Paul is not suggesting superficial positive thinking. He is teaching intentional filtering. He is saying that what occupies your mind shapes your spiritual experience. When you mentally repeat the idea that something will go wrong, even without concrete evidence, that repetition begins to feel true. The mind grows accustomed to the narrative, and what is repeated frequently starts to take on the appearance of reality. You stop recognizing that it began as a hypothesis and start treating it as certainty. That is the power of mental repetition. The problem is not thinking something negative once. The problem is reinforcing that thought daily, elaborating on it, imagining it in multiple scenarios. Every repetition strengthens internal connections. Every time you revisit the same worry, it becomes more familiar. And what is familiar feels safe, even when it is destructive. You can begin to cling to your own anxiety as if it were a form of protection. Mental patterns shape invisible beliefs, and invisible beliefs shape perception. If you believe, even subconsciously, that you will always be rejected, you will interpret neutral behavior as rejection. If you believe you are never enough, you will see any criticism as confirmation. Your perception of reality becomes filtered not by objective truth, but by beliefs built through repetition. That is why Paul provides specific criteria. He does not simply say, think better. He gives a lens: true, just, pure, lovely. This implies analysis. It requires asking, is this thought actually true? Is it aligned with reality, or is it a projection of my fear? Does it produce life, or does it reinforce insecurity? This kind of questioning interrupts the automatic cycle. The mind operates through continuous reinforcement. What you feed grows, what you starve weakens. When you allow thoughts of comparison, guilt, or catastrophe to occupy constant space, they stop being occasional visitors and become permanent residents. And permanent residents shape behavior, emotions, and decisions. You may have noticed how certain worries surface faster than others. That happens because they have been reinforced countless times. The mind creates shortcuts. The more often you walk a mental path, the easier it becomes to return to it. So even after praying, you return to the old pattern because it is already consolidated internally. This mechanism explains why some people live in a constant state of alert. It's not only circumstances, it's repeated mental structure. And repeated structure creates ongoing expectation of threat. When your expectation is negative, your interpretation of life becomes negative. Peace cannot take root where the mind is trained to anticipate danger at all times. Philippians 4:8 is not decorative advice, it is a reconstruction strategy. By intentionally directing your mind toward what is true and worthy of praise, you begin weakening old patterns and strengthening new internal pathways. This does not happen in one day, but every conscious choice gradually reshapes your mental structure. What you think about frequently becomes the lens through which you interpret God, people, and circumstances. If that lens is distorted by constant fear, even clear promises will seem fragile. If that lens is built on truth, even difficult situations can be faced with stability. The difference lies not only in the prayer you prayed, but in the thought you sustained afterward. Understanding this mechanism is essential. Without this clarity, you will keep treating symptoms while ignoring the root. Peace is not merely the result of a momentary spiritual experience. It is sustained by a mind trained to remain anchored in what is true. And that leads us to an even more direct responsibility in how we handle our own thoughts. There is a decisive point that many people avoid facing deeply. Prayer does not replace mental discipline. Prayer is essential. It is relationship with God. It is sincere surrender. It is acknowledged dependence. But prayer alone does not automatically dismantle mental structures that have been reinforced for years. If you do not learn to deal with your thoughts intentionally, you will continue experiencing momentary relief, but not lasting structural transformation. Often you pray for calm, clarity, and confidence, and you genuinely feel peace in that moment. But as the day unfolds, your mind returns to old patterns as if nothing happened. This does not mean your prayer was weak. It means there is an active mental system still operating on autopilot. And until that system is confronted, it will continue sabotaging what you ask for in prayer. The Bible does not present the mind as neutral territory. In 2 Corinthians 10:5, Paul says we must take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Take captive is strong language. It does not suggest passive observation. It suggests capture, interruption, submission. That reveals that thoughts are not innocent mental events. They have direction, they have impact, and they must be evaluated. When Paul speaks of taking thoughts captive, he assumes not every thought is trustworthy. Some arise from fear, others from pride, others from unresolved experiences. If you accept all of them as absolute truth, your mind becomes open ground. And open ground without vigilance quickly becomes territory dominated by distorted narratives. Mental discipline does not mean denying that thoughts appear. They will appear. The question is what you do with them once they do. Do you automatically develop them? Do you build stories around them? Do you rehearse them internally until they feel unquestionable? Or do you confront them with the truth you know? That choice determines whether you will be governed by your mind or govern your mind. Many Christians expect prayer to solve what requires active cooperation. They pray for God to remove anxiety, yet continue feeding anxious thoughts. They pray for confidence, yet internally repeat phrases of incapacity. There is a silent disconnect between what they ask for and what they mentally cultivate, and that disconnect produces instability. Spiritual warfare often begins in thought long before it manifests externally. It is not always visible. It is internal. It is the battle between the truth you know and the narrative you repeat. If you do not learn to identify this battle, you will continue interpreting your struggles as circumstantial when many of them are structural. Mature spirituality requires internal governance. Governance does not mean emotional repression. It means conscious leadership of your own mind. It means deciding that not every thought will be given permanent space. It means recognizing that if you do not exercise authority over your internal narrative, it will exercise authority over you. Without mental discipline, prayer becomes a cycle of temporary relief. You pray, feel peace, and soon after return to reinforcing the same negative assumptions. It's like building something in the morning and dismantling it in the afternoon. As long as this dynamic continues, you will experience fragmented spirituality, moments of faith followed by long stretches of instability. There is also a dimension of responsibility that can feel uncomfortable. It is easier to believe instability comes only from external circumstances. But when you realize part of the problem lies in how you allow your mind to operate, something shifts. You understand that you are not completely at the mercy of what happens around you. There is real space for decision and transformation. Taking every thought captive means interrupting the automatic flow. It means asking, is this aligned with Christ? Does this reflect truth or just fear? Does this strengthen my faith or weaken it? This kind of questioning is not excessive. It is maturity. It is training. And training produces consistency. Without this conscious exercise, you can become a sincere Christian, but mentally undisciplined. And that combination produces frustration. You love God, yet you don't understand why your peace doesn't remain. The answer may not be a lack of devotion, but a lack of daily mental filtering. When prayer and discipline walk together, something different begins to happen. Prayer stops being just a moment and becomes a direction. Your thoughts begin to reflect what you declare. Your mind starts sustaining what you ask for, and peace shifts from being episodic to becoming progressively stable. If you recognize that you need to develop this discipline and want to continue learning in a practical and biblical way how to strengthen your mind and your faith, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. Our goal here is not just motivation, but real spiritual maturity. Turn on notifications and continue walking this path of intentional transformation. Guarding your heart is not an optional suggestion for those who want spiritual stability. It is a structural principle. Proverbs 4:23 declares, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Notice the priority, above all else. This means that beyond many external disciplines, there is an ongoing internal responsibility. Guarding implies active vigilance, not passive neglect. When the Bible speaks of the heart, it is not referring only to feelings. It refers to the center of your inner life, mind, will, emotions, perceptions, and decisions. It is where narratives form. It is where interpretations are built. If that center is not protected, everything flowing from it will be affected. And since the issues of life flow from the heart, any internal distortion will eventually appear externally. Think about how many stimuli you receive every single day. Constant comparisons on social media, news that reinforces fear, pessimistic conversations at work, comments that seem harmless but that you internalize as criticism, old memories resurfacing in moments of vulnerability. All of this competes for space inside you. Without a filter, these stimuli turn into recurring thoughts. The problem is not simply receiving information, it is mentally developing that information without questioning it. When you replay a comparison repeatedly, it stops being just external data and becomes an internal narrative. When you revisit a fear multiple times a day, it stops being a possibility and becomes an expectation. And constant expectation shapes emotion. Guarding your heart means choosing how to process what reaches you. You cannot control every external stimulus, but you can control what you feed internally. There is a difference between being exposed to something and allowing it to establish permanent residence in your mind. Without vigilance, you absorb everything. And what is absorbed begins shaping your identity. Often you pray for serenity, but spend hours feeding comparison, anticipated fear, or silent guilt. Prayer creates momentary alignment. Lack of guarding dissolves that alignment throughout the day. It is not that God withdrew peace. It is that unfiltered thoughts began occupying space again. Guarding requires daily responsibility, not occasional awareness. It means noticing when a thought begins gaining strength and interrupting it before it becomes dominant. It means recognizing when a negative memory is distorting your present perception and choosing not to deepen that mental path. This kind of awareness prevents old patterns from consolidating again. Whoever does not guard absorbs everything indiscriminately. And when everything influences you, your stability becomes dependent on your environment. If the day goes well, you feel peaceful. If something unexpected happens, your internal structure collapses. That is not spiritual weakness. It is lack of filtering. An unguarded mind becomes vulnerable to external fluctuations. There is also a powerful preventive dimension in this principle. It is far easier to prevent a thought from gaining strength than to dismantle a belief that is already established. Small daily repetitions build deep internal structures. If you do not watch early, you will have to rebuild later, and rebuilding always requires more effort. Guarding your heart also involves identifying your most sensitive areas. Some people are more affected by comparison, others by fear of rejection, others by feelings of inadequacy. Knowing your vulnerabilities helps you increase vigilance in those specific areas. This is not spiritual paranoia, it is emotional maturity. Proverbs does not present this care as optional because the issues of life depend on it. Your interpretation of circumstances, your reading of people's behavior, and even your perception of God's presence pass through the filter of the heart. If that filter is contaminated by unexamined thoughts, everything will be interpreted in a distorted way. Perhaps you expected peace to be automatic after prayer, but Scripture shows that lasting peace is the result of intentional guarding. When you protect what enters, you protect what flows out. And this continuous practice begins producing stability that does not depend so heavily on external fluctuations. This ongoing vigilance prepares you for something even deeper, recognizing how your internal narrative can completely distort your perception of spiritual reality, even when God is already clearly at work. And that is exactly what we need to examine next. There comes a moment in the spiritual life when the greatest problem is not the circumstance itself, but the way you interpret that circumstance. Your internal narrative can completely distort reality, even when the facts do not support such extreme conclusions. You may be going through a difficult season, but your mind magnifies that difficulty until it feels permanent, absolute, and without escape. And when interpretation is distorted, your spiritual perception becomes distorted as well. A powerful example of this is found in 1 Kings 19 in the story of Elijah. After experiencing one of the greatest demonstrations of God's power on Mount Carmel, he collapses emotionally. A single threat is enough to make him run, isolate himself, and even ask to die. He declares before God, "I alone am left." That statement reveals more than fear. It reveals an internal narrative already shaped by exhaustion and fatigue. Notice that Elijah was not actually alone. God had preserved 7,000 who had not bowed to Baal. But in that moment, Elijah's perception was limited by what he felt. His mind built a conclusion based on recent threat and emotional depletion, and that conclusion began to feel like absolute truth. This is deeply relevant to you. Elijah had not lost his calling. He had not stopped being a prophet. God had not withdrawn his presence. What happened was a temporary distortion of perception. Fatigue, fear, and pressure created a negative lens through which he began to see everything. The internal narrative became stronger than the objective facts. How often do you do the same? A delay becomes confirmation that nothing will work out. A single failure becomes proof of permanent incapacity. A temporary silence feels like definitive abandonment. Your mind builds a story consistent with the fear already active inside you. And the more you repeat that story, the more real it feels. The mind has the ability to select evidence. It highlights what confirms the dominant narrative and ignores what contradicts it. Elijah highlighted Jezebel's threat but ignored the recent miracle. He emphasized immediate danger but forgot God's ongoing faithfulness. When the mind selects only negative elements, faith begins to feel fragile, even when God is still at work. Notice also the order of restoration. God does not immediately send Elijah back to his mission. First, he addresses his internal state. He provides rest. He provides food. He provides quiet. Then he corrects the narrative. "I have reserved 7,000 in Israel." Before restoring purpose, God restores perception. This reveals that a distorted mind must be realigned before important decisions are made. When your internal narrative is misaligned, even biblical promises can feel fragile. You may read that God cares for you, yet interpret any difficulty as proof of abandonment. You may intellectually know that God is faithful, yet feel isolated. Not because it is true, but because your internal lens has been shaped by repeated unfiltered thoughts. Your internal narrative organizes your reality. It determines what is central and what is peripheral. If fear becomes central, everything looks like a threat. If insecurity dominates, every comment feels like destructive criticism. If inadequacy is active, every mistake reinforces that identity. The story you tell yourself defines how you experience the world. Perhaps the situation you are facing truly is difficult. This is not about denying facts. It is about examining interpretation. The essential question is not only what is happening, but how am I interpreting what is happening? That distinction can prevent decisions based on distorted conclusions. Without that examination, you may react to your own narrative rather than to reality. You may quit too soon. You may withdraw from people who have not rejected you. You may interpret silence as indifference, and in this way, mental distortion creates concrete consequences in your spiritual and relational life. When you begin challenging your own internal story, something shifts. You stop assuming that your first interpretation is the most accurate one. You create space for biblical truth to reorient your perception. Just as God corrected Elijah's vision before restoring his mission, you allow truth to reorganize your reading of reality. Without that adjustment, the cycle continues. Distorted interpretation produces unstable emotion. Unstable emotion produces impulsive decisions, and impulsive decisions reinforce the original narrative. But when the narrative is aligned with truth, your reading of reality becomes more balanced. You begin to see not only the threat, but also the provision. Not only the difficulty, but also God's constant presence in the process. And this correction of perception prepares the ground for something even deeper, a structural transformation of the mind that does not depend on occasional adjustment, but on continuous and intentional renewal. Up to this point, you've already realized that instability does not arise only from circumstances, but from how your mind is structured to interpret them. That is exactly why Romans 12:2 becomes one of the most decisive texts in this process. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Notice carefully, transformation does not begin externally. It begins internally. It does not start with what changes around you, but with what is reorganized within you. Renewing the mind is not having an occasional positive thought when something goes wrong. It is replacing old mental structures with new ones aligned with truth. It is an ongoing process of reconstruction. For years, you may have repeated thoughts of fear, comparison, scarcity, or inadequacy. Those thoughts created internal pathways. Renewal means creating new pathways through intentional repetition of thoughts grounded in biblical truth. To conform, as Paul writes, means to take the shape of something. If you do not actively renew your mind, it will automatically take the shape of its environment. Culture reinforces anxiety. Social media reinforces comparison. News reinforces constant threat. If you do not intentionally resist, your mind will be shaped by those stimuli. Renewal is the conscious act of refusing to let the environment determine your internal structure. Structural transformation requires deliberate repetition. It is not enough to interrupt a negative thought once. You must consistently replace it until a new pattern is consolidated. If for years you mentally reinforce the idea of failure, it is unrealistic to expect that a single declaration of faith will dismantle that structure. Renewal is a cumulative process. It is important to understand that renewing does not mean ignoring emotions. Emotions are legitimate responses, but they follow interpretation. If interpretation is distorted, emotion will be disproportionate. When you learn to adjust interpretation through truth, your emotions gradually begin to align. Peace does not come from denying difficulty, but from correctly interpreting difficulty. Renewing the mind requires daily intention. If you do not direct your thoughts, they will be directed by old habits. The mind tends to return to what is familiar. That is why renewal does not happen by accident. It requires vigilance, repetition, and conscious choice. It is spiritual training applied to everyday life. Many people want transformation without process. They want emotional stability without mental reconstruction. But Romans 12:2 reveals that transformation is the direct result of renewal. It is not merely an intense spiritual experience. It is the reorganization of how you think. It is a change of lens. It is the replacement of narrative. When you begin renewing your mind, something shifts in how you respond to situations. You create space between stimulus and response. Instead of automatically accepting a negative thought, you pause, you evaluate, you ask whether it aligns with truth. That small space is a sign of growing maturity. It is in that space that peace begins to become consistent. Renewal also reshapes identity. If for years you defined yourself by mistakes, failures, or rejection, a renewed mind begins redefining who you are in light of what God declares. That shift in identity alters posture, decisions, and direction. You do not just think differently. You begin acting differently because your internal structure has changed. This process does not eliminate external challenges. Problems still exist, but the difference is that your mind stops automatically amplifying them. You begin seeing difficulty without turning it into catastrophe. You interpret silence without assuming abandonment. You face uncertainty without concluding defeat. A trained mind sustains lasting peace because it does not react only to what it sees, it responds based on consolidated truth. And consolidated truth does not come from a single moment, but from constant repetition. Every time you choose to replace a distorted thought with one aligned with truth, you strengthen a new internal structure. Perhaps you are realizing that you need more than intense moments of prayer. You need daily mental discipline. You need conscious repetition of truth until it becomes natural. This consistent practice builds a foundation that sustains peace even when circumstances are challenging. Renewing the mind is not abstract theory. It is concrete practice. It is deciding today which narrative you will allow to govern your perception. It is choosing to repeat what strengthens your faith instead of what reinforces your fear. And when that choice becomes a habit, transformation stops being a distant promise and becomes progressive reality. Up to this point, you've understood the diagnosis, the root, and the process of renewal. Now we need to bring this to a practical level, because without concrete application, everything we've discussed remains a concept. Colossians 3:2 says, "Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things." This is not just spiritual inspiration. It is deliberate mental direction. It is choosing where your mind will rest. Breaking the mental cycle begins with identification. You cannot correct what you do not recognize. What thought repeats most often in your mind when something goes wrong? Is it fear of failure, a sense of rejection, an expectation of scarcity? Every mind has a dominant thought under pressure. Identifying it is the first step to breaking the cycle. After identifying it, you must question it. Is this thought a fact or an interpretation? Is it based on real evidence or automatic repetition? Many times you will realize you are not dealing with objective reality, but with projection. Questioning does not mean denying the situation. It means examining the narrative you created about it. The third step is to immediately interrupt the expansion. Thoughts gain strength when they are developed. When you begin imagining details, building internal dialogues, and anticipating negative outcomes, you are feeding the old structure. Interrupting means stopping the amplification before it consolidates emotionally. Then comes substitution. It is not enough to remove a thought. You must replace it. Colossians 3:2 instructs you to direct your mind toward what aligns with God's perspective. That means replacing fear with a specific promise, replacing internal accusation with biblical truth, replacing assumption with grounded reality. This process must become daily. It is not an occasional exercise. It is consistent discipline. Every time the dominant thought reappears, you repeat the cycle. Identify, question, interrupt, and replace. Over time, the old mental structure weakens and the new one begins to solidify. Peace depends less on circumstances and more on internal consistency. It is important to understand that this does not automatically eliminate difficult emotions, but it changes the speed at which they gain strength. When the mind is trained, emotion does not dominate with the same intensity. There is space for conscious response. That space is a sign of spiritual maturity. You begin to notice something different. Situations that once completely destabilized you are now processed with greater balance. Not because the challenges disappeared, but because your narrative changed. A directed mind creates progressive stability. Peace stops being fragile and begins becoming structural. Perhaps today you realize your instability did not come from a lack of faith, but from a lack of mental direction. Prayer remains essential, but now it is accompanied by vigilance, discipline, and intentional substitution. Over time, that changes everything. If you want to continue learning how to develop this practical maturity, strengthen your mind, and build a consistent faith, subscribe to the channel now. Here we approach spiritual life with depth and real application. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next teachings that will help you grow in a structured way. The peace you are seeking is not unreachable. It begins with the daily choice of the thought you decide to sustain. And that choice, repeated consistently, transforms not only your mind, but your entire life. Throughout this video, you have realized something you may never have considered clearly before. Your peace does not disappear only because of circumstances. Often, it is weakened by the narrative you sustain after you pray. You speak with God, surrender your worries, yet continue internally repeating thoughts that move in the opposite direction of what you asked. And that silent inconsistency creates instability. Isaiah 26:3 declares, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you." Notice the condition. The promise of peace is connected to a steadfast mind, not just momentary faith, continuous mental stability. A steadfast mind is not a perfect mind, but a directed one, a mind that repeatedly chooses to remain aligned with truth. God has not denied you peace. He has not withdrawn stability as punishment. Scripture shows that peace is sustained when the mind remains fixed. That means there is active participation on your part. Prayer opens the door. Mental discipline keeps that door open. Continuous renewal consolidates what you ask for. Perhaps today you realize the problem was never a lack of faith. It was a lack of filtering. It was allowing repeated thoughts to become dominant beliefs. It was permitting distorted interpretations to shape your spiritual perception. But this realization is not condemnation. It is liberation, because what was learned can be unlearned. The peace you are seeking does not depend on controlling every circumstance. It depends on choosing which narrative will govern your mind. Every time you identify a recurring thought and decide to replace it with a specific biblical truth, you strengthen a new internal structure. And new structures produce new outcomes. Before we close, I want to propose something simple and quiet. Today, yes, today, identify one thought that has been draining your peace. Not a generic one, but the one that repeats most often. And consciously replace it with a clear truth from Scripture. Repeat that truth every time the old pattern tries to return. This small act can begin a deep transformation. You are not condemned to live oscillating between faith and fear. You can develop a steadfast mind. You can learn to direct your thoughts. You can build a peace that depends less on the environment and more on internal alignment. And it starts with a daily decision: what you choose to feed. From now on, may your prayer not be just a moment of relief, but the beginning of a new mental direction. And may your mind, trained in truth, become the ground where peace finds permanence. If this message brought clarity and helped you see your spiritual life more deeply, share this video with someone who also needs to reorganize their mind. Keep walking in this process. Transformation is progressive, but it is real.